I'm Emily Zayden, the director of the Craft in America Center here in Los Angeles. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you so much to these three incredible artists who are with us. And we will be talking in depth about their connections, their overlaps, their history, and their connections to certainly Southern California. And this all began essentially because of an exhibition that's currently at LAX called LA Made, which Craft in America organized. And it's an installation, mixed media group of artists from the LA area who have moved craft into new directions in terms of exploration with materials and techniques. All of these artists are strong voices in terms of teaching and modeling and pushing their material into new realms. So Karyl Sisson, Carrie Burckle, and Ferne Jacobs, thank you so much for being here today to discuss your work. We wanted fiber to be a focus of that installation because that has been such a strong part of the art world here in Southern California for many, many decades. And you are each so influential within that as voices and visionary. I wanted to begin with where each of you first, your earliest memories really of where fiber began to interest you and strike you, and how you really initiated that interest in working with fiber. Let's start with Karyl.
Okay. I was in New York. Let's see. I went to NYU. I studied painting and drawing undergraduate. And I would say that the first real interest in fiber came through the work of Klaus Oldenburg, because he was making these soft sculptures. And I feel like his work validated cloth as a legitimate art form.
And earlier on, even childhood, and we might come back to this, but I know, I believe a family member, your mother, had worked in the textile industry.
My mom was a buyer for Bonwateller. So it was fashion. I wouldn't really call it textile. And I didn't really learn how to sew until I came to California and learned patchwork quilting from a coworker in the 70s.
Okay. Carrie, how about you? And all of you, in terms of your backgrounds, you know, have spent your professional lives as artists in the LA area, if not spent more of your childhood here. So Carrie, you came here, was it fourth grade?
Fourth grade. I feel like I am a product of Southern California because we moved into a new tract housing development in Orange County. Orange County was a new idea, a new development. As a kid, we were dropped off at the beach every day. It was beautiful blonde surf culture, and I totally felt like the odd man out. I grew up in a household of 4 brothers. But during the time, I'm thinking about the pop art movement, I'm thinking about civil rights, I'm thinking about the women's movement. All that had a big influence on making. And I started out embroidering and making my own clothes, making jean skirts. There was that whole wearable art movement. So that was a big influence early on in my making. And also I went to a high school that had ceramics and jewelry.
Okay, great, thank you. And where was that?
In Costa Mesa and Huntington Beach.
Okay, great. And Ferne, you came here as a young child, right? Southern California.
Yes, from Chicago at 2. I was 2 years old. But it was interesting for a long time. I longed for a big city for some reason. Like coming here at 2, you'd think that I would not have any memory of Chicago. but LA was not a real city to me, you know, growing up. But my earliest memories are that we had a Girl Scout, one of the heads of our Girl Scout troop. She was very interested in making things, and I learned how to embroider with her, and I felt very close to the things that she taught. And I knew that I liked working with my hands. And my first kind of connection to fiber as I got older, I also was studying painting. I was going to be a painter, but before Melrose became popular, and I have no understanding of this. I was on Melrose walking, you know, just looking around, but this was before I think it got popular. This was in the mid 60s. And there was weavings in a window of one of these shops. It wasn't even a shop, it was a studio. There was weaving, and I just walked into the studio, and this man was working. I have no idea who it was. I never saw him again. I never saw that work again. But he had weavings around, and they were almost like fashion, like faces, you know, with beautiful lips and that kind of thing, but they were tapestries. And he had these weavings and these looms. And I heard of a painting teacher at Barnsdall, and I noticed that they taught weaving. And I just got fascinated being in that studio. I love the feeling of the yarn. The smell of the yarn. And maybe this is a kind of a very feminine thing in my own being, that I suddenly was relating to that, and took the weaving class and the painting class, fell in love with weaving, and painting went out the window, and I started devoting myself to fiber.
Carrie, weaving as an entree into fiber art for each of you, how did that factor in?
Well, I'm going to say this is my weaving book from the late 70s, rather. And I went to Cal State Long Beach because I wanted to learn how to weave. I didn't know anything about weaving. I knew how to sew and embroider macrame. That was as far. But so Long Beach State opened up a whole new possibilities working with materials.
And I also wonder, as far as basket making, basket weaving, and which is an element for you all. But Karyl, you went to UCLA after very different initial start in New York, and for your MFA. Can you tell us a little bit about that, studying with Bernard Kester, and how that program was structured?
Sure. When I went to graduate school, it was because I felt like the work that I had been doing, which you will see the early work here at some point.
Yeah, we will.
It was three-dimensional wall art, and I just kind of felt stuck. So I decided to go to UCLA because I was inspired by a number of the artists who had either gone there or were teaching there. And especially because of Bernard Kester and his presence in seeing fiber art as sculptural form. And I think at first when I went to UCLA, as I said, I was doing more two-dimensional rather, wall pieces, and I was encouraged to do three-dimensional work, to go bigger, and to find ways of taking the elements that I collected and joining them in a way that did not use glue or nails, and basketry for me was the answer to that.
Excellent.
So you're looking at a very early work, pre-UCLA.
UCLA.
Pre-UCLA.
Really, really.
So that interest was there, and in terms of the exposure at UCLA, that really led you into.
I think I found my own voice at UCLA. And this, you're looking at current work now,
Yes,
within the last couple of years.
we're cycling through some exemplary pieces for each of the artists, along with the pieces that are on view at LAX in terms of the images that you're seeing.
And these are plated vintage paper drinking straws. And I've been working with paper drinking straws for a number of years on and off.
You mentioned as far as the three-dimensional form, and I wonder for Ferne and for Carrie, where that came in, and because Ferne, you had started talking about weaving, would like to think a little bit about where you made that shift from two-dimensional weaving into form.
Is it my turn? Should
Yeah.
I speak? Should I speak?
Yeah.
Well, I went to Barnstall, and the woman who taught there was this staunch German woman who had us doing patterns, and we had to do them in a certain order. And I somehow got to a workshop with Arlene Fish, who is a well-known jeweler, but she weaves in metal. And she gave a workshop at the Hand Weavers Guild. And I took the workshop and I did all these weaving. She taught us how to weave on a frame. And so I really started piecing things, and I brought them to my class, and the woman wouldn't even look at them. So I called Arlene Fish and said, can I come study with you? And she was giving a workshop in San Diego. I went and worked with her for a week. And she said, you should go to Long Beach State. And she would talk to Mary Jane Leland to see that I got in. And I went for a year to Long Beach State, and I just wove. I never entered the college. I audited weaving. I audited the weaving class. And we were talking about Carrie, we were talking yesterday while we were preparing. Carrie said that Mary Jane had us doing upholstery and fabrics. Well, I wasn't taking the class, so I could do pretty much what I wanted to do. So I made a lot of weavings. I made my pieces, my art pieces. And at the end of the year, she said, well, you know, you wouldn't have gotten an A. You didn't hand in a notebook, and you didn't do all of the patterns. I said, well, isn't that great that I didn't take this class for credit? But I had more weavings than anybody else. I had done all these weavings. Well, Joan Austin came, who was there a year before me, and she had gone to Haystack, and she showed us slides, and I saw how beautiful. I wanted to go to Haystack, and I ended up studying with Olga de Almaral at Haystack, who is an international figure in fiber. And I asked her, should I go to Long Beach State? They want me to go and get a degree, or should I get a loom and go home and go to work? And she said, get the loom and go home and go to work. And that's what I did. So I started working. Joan Austin had been at Cranbrook. She was at Cranbrook at that time. And she is the one, she was studying off loom fiber techniques. She was studying these Indian basket making techniques. And I happened to go to a workshop that she was giving to have lunch with her, not to be in the workshop, I was having lunch with her. And I just picked up the instructions, which were coiling instructions. I asked one of the students if I could watch what she was doing. She showed me what she was doing. I went home that night, I started coiling, and I never stopped. That's how I got involved. I learned how to knot from Netta al-Halali at UCLA one summer. And twining, I'm not sure where I picked that up, but those are the 3 techniques that I use. And I might have picked up twining from Joan somehow, or I don't know how I found out how to do that. But anyway, that's how I got into 3-dimensional. I wanted to get off the loom. The loom for me was too restricted, too rectangle, all those threads you had to deal with that rectangle of threads. Weaving was soft. Joan showed me that you could make something hard, 3-dimensional, and very naturally. You just could make it very naturally. And I've been doing that ever since. And this was around 1968 or 1969, I think.
Fantastic. Yeah, you have so many connections to so many pivotal artists and are part of that incredible network. There's a lot of history to trace there. Karyl, in terms of, and there's so much overlap between each of you and your networks of mentors, peers. Let's see, as far as Karyl, you and basket making techniques and when that shifted for you, was that at UCLA? When did that really happen?
Yes, because I was looking for ways to connect the things that I had collected over the years. And I work with all the things I work with are not, they're not natural, they're man-made or manufactured. And I think it made a big difference to find basketry. And in fact, I just taught myself how to put things together. I was never formally trained. In the 60s, during the counterculture movement, I was doing some macrame and batik, but, and I did take an adult ed weaving class at one point. And like Ferne said, weaving did not do it for me. I needed eventually to get to the 3-dimensional.
And at the time, the base that you received at UCLA, supportive in terms of expression and breaking away by that point in time, was that the emphasis of the department? Was it accepted?
Totally accepted, encouraged. The department, yes, not necessarily UCLA art department, but design and fiber, absolutely.
Okay. And in addition to Bernard Kester, the other pivotal teachers at that point for you?
Well, Lois Swernoff was a pivotal teacher for me because she introduced me to books by Peter Stevens and Darcy Thompson, and these are all related to how things develop, patterns in nature. And I don't create that way, but whatever was in those books became inspirational for me. And so nature, in fact, I just took off from that. So I have to give her credit for that, even though I can't remember the names of the 2 seminars that I took with her. And then also, when I was there, Adrian Sachs was the chairman of the ceramics department. And I took a couple of seminars with him, and I learned sort of the critical thinking that was going on in ceramics at the time. And I really felt like, wow, why can't I make things out of cloth or paper and address them like they're ceramic forms? So I did that.
You did, most definitely. Carrie, how about you in terms of, and your practice also shifts as well between technique and the 3-dimensional and 2-dimensional. but at that point, in terms of your training?
Well, the piece Dusk here is a piece I made with Jim Bassler at Appalachian Center for Crafts. But it was really Mary Jane Leland who told me to go to Appalachian Center for Crafts after my undergraduate degree. But Mary Jane really instilled in her students a level of expertise. I really enjoyed weaving, but for Mary Jane, it was about pattern and repeat and what you could do with the warp and weft. And I will admit I wasn't very good at it. And I wanted to be more expressive, which is ideas I found at Appalachian Center for Crafts. But what was great about Long Beach State and Mary Jane is she came from Cranbrook, and she taught history of textiles, and she taught weaving and surface design, and then she brought in adjunct faculty. And I remember Hiromi Oda being an influence in my life, and Hiromi also came from Cranbrook, and she was an adjunct faculty member, and she taught basketry and shibori and how to make patterns in clothing. So she brought that to the curriculum, but Mary Jane was very rigorous and demanding, and so of course you wanted to rise to her expectations. And I think of talking about, was it Ferne or Karyl that talked about Klaus Oldenburg? Maybe it was Karyl. I think about him, and I think about Robert Rauschenberg and how those two artists used materials, and they gave us permission, I think, to also experiment with materials. And of course, I think about Jack Linner Larson. And I worked at the Pacific Design Center after college in a showroom called China Seas, which is right next door to his showroom. And of course, we have all of these amazing books from that time. So I have the Art Fabric Mainstream, I have Beyond Craft. So I'm sure a lot of people in our audience have these books as well. But those are the books that I studied intently, and they had a big influence. But I really didn't learn basketry, or didn't have much experience with basketry until I was a grad student, also at Cal State Long Beach.
Right. Okay. Excellent. Let's see. As far as the ways that your work absorbed aspects of, I know, Karyl, you've spoken a little bit about the contrast to your work here versus what was happening in New York. Ferne, the positioning of what was happening here in Southern California versus elsewhere in the country. I wonder, and Carrie as well, what you felt was different about what was happening here. And you all were being in your careers at slightly different points in time, but how you felt that the fiber scene was different here than what was happening elsewhere, maybe more room for possibility here than elsewhere. Whoever wants to take a stab at that.
Okay, I will. So I left New York when I was 24, and this was 1972. So at that time, the art world was dominated by men, and when the artists that influenced me were Klaus Oldenburg, in part when I was younger and undergraduate, in part because of his beautiful drawings, and also his soft sculptures. And I was also influenced by Joseph Cornell, who made these beautiful and poetic collage boxes. But when I came to California, I found female artists that were inspiring to me, like Betty Saar, not versus Cornell, but a totally different perspective. And she was using fabric and thread and some found objects. And certainly Miriam Shapiro and Judy Chicago and Woman House and that whole energy of feminist thought and feminist possibilities. What could be said? And I took that in.
Ferne, how about your thoughts about what was happening here versus elsewhere? And you certainly had connections to artists everywhere.
Some thoughts that come to me, going back to Haystack and studying with Olga de Almeral, she lives in Colombia. I think she's still alive. And Jack Larson came that summer, and I met Jack Larson that summer. And he was a huge influence on really helping Fiverr get attention. Okay, Carrie showed you the books through his books, and he really supported us, which was really amazing. The thoughts that come to me, I spent a year in New York in the 60s, and I had this an eye-opening experience for me was going to a concert with John Cage and Merce Cunningham. This was at Avery Hall, whatever the first name is. And Rauschenberg doing, the video or the film behind, and the umbrellas, the umbrella. And that had a very powerful effect on me. And I don't know, just opening me up to, I can't even remember now, but I was taking painting at Pratt at the time, and I had a huge argument with my teacher because he was a realist painter. And I was in my 20s, and he and I really sat and argued with each other. So that's New York. That's one experience of mine in New York. Coming home to LA, for me, it was, I think if I'd stayed in New York, there's a lot of pressure in New York to be a success. And whenever I'm in New York, people always want to talk about careers. Coming back to LA, I think I could really follow my own path. LA was much more open. And when we talked a little bit about this yesterday in preparation, and I thought, if anything moves me about Southern California, it's the desert. That somehow I feel that my work comes out of the earth, and something, at one time I really felt like I was an old Indian basket maker. And what does she do? She just sits in the desert and she makes these pieces in her lap. Of course, I'm not going to do anything from that tradition. I found in our time, we have a more individual direction, and I became involved with my own individual direction.
That's great. Yeah, we're beginning to delve into how the landscape influences each of your work in terms of the abstract. Carrie, I don't know if you wanted to add to the thoughts about what potential openness there was in Southern California when you were studying and emerging versus other places, and also noting that each of you are female artists, and you turned to this medium, and that there was the possibility to explore this medium at that point in time is something to note.
I'll say I can't picture how the landscape actually influenced me, really, other than wanting to be a strong woman, and the women's movement really interested me, socially, politically.
How about in terms of the materials that you access in your work?
Well, considering my education, I think during the late 70s, early 80s, you were taught, like I was really influenced by my professors about working with materials, getting to know your materials, and that really that craft culture, the craft notion of once you know your materials, then you have the capacity to create, just about anything. And I don't know if we have that so much today going on in education. I feel like it's more conceptual and maybe more experiential. So that's what I'll offer.
Karyl, you also access unusual materials and unconventional materials. I wonder if some of that is at all influenced by the Southern California landscape, maybe not the environment, but cultural landscape.
Definitely, because when I came out here and I was working for a year or two, I learned about the Rose Bowl flea market. And I started going monthly and found myself drawn to objects and things that reminded me of my childhood. And so these are things that I ended up collecting, including buttons and zippers and some toys and clothespins. And they eventually worked their way into my artwork. And like I said, I think also I want to say something about California. New York, I loved living in New York, but I guess I was ready to leave because it felt kind of crowded and oppressive in the city sometimes, even though there was tremendous energy and fantastic culture. In LA, everything felt so open, and I appreciate that now, especially where I live. And I think my work is fed by the natural environment emotionally.
Lenore Tawney was a huge influence on you, Ferne, and getting back towards the mentors for each of you and inspiration. Could you talk a little bit about your relationship with her and her influence on your work and outlook?
I mean, I see her as my creative mother. Although, as I said, I was already exhibiting, our relationship was quite equal, but she was 35 years older. I can't remember exactly. I think she was 35 years older than me, but I knew her for 35 years. I mean, I met her when she was 65. She lived to be 100. And what we shared, what I saw, she was the most interesting person I've ever known. And the reason, because she had such a wide personality, and we could share so many sides of ourselves together, and we were very honest with each other.
Let's see, as far as from moving from this kind of, well, we've jumped around a little bit in terms of history, but your mentors and these earlier developmental moments and connections with people, and there's such important a web here really of individuals that you all know in common and who have influenced you. I'm wondering though, what shift in terms of pivotal moments that shifted and pushed your work forward, whether it's, I know we talked a little bit about Bernard Kester and Dominic Demare, for instance, and publishing your work and amplifying it nationally. What were some of those moments for each of you that helped really move it forward? Karyl, if you
Okay.
start.
I think it was being invited to be in the Poetry of the Physical show, which was a very large show that was opening the new American Craft Museum in New York City. And that was 1986. And I had graduated from UCLA in '85. That was one thing. Another show was Frontiers in Fibers, The Americans. And I'm pretty sure that show traveled in Europe. And that might have been the show, I could be off on this, but this might have been the show where the work was in Tiananmen Square at the time of the revolution. And that was pretty amazing. I think for me, the 80s, and also a number of books were being published in the 80s, basketry oriented. Jacqueline Orr Larson had written a book, and they're behind me, but I can't think of them all right now, but being published, and usually it was through the eye of the basketry maker at that time. And that, I think there were galleries that paid attention to me as a result of those shows. And I also want to add that I did not mention, I did not have a lot of personal mentors per se, but I feel I got a lot from the books that, oh, I'm drawing a blank. Northern California. Thank you. Yes, his books and his approach to basketry, any materials were possible. And also, I mentioned Lois Swernoff because she also turned me on to books like Indigenous architecture, vernacular architecture, and to see that those kind of structures that were handmade, really, and they connected the environment and culture in a way that I found fascinating.
Yes, and which has been a key aspect of your work, I'd say, the quality of your work definitely, or a theme of of much of your work, exploring architecture. Carrie, as far as yes, perceptions of your work and a push, and also curious about feeling how it fits in with what's happening nationally. Is there a sense of isolation for you being here in Southern California? Was there, or did you feel like you were connected to what was happening nationally?
Not as a young student, I didn't feel that. So after college, I think when I started to apply to juried shows. But I just want to say something a little bit about Jim Bassler, and that when I was with him, he talked about John Cage and, you know, throwing the die and giving yourself a set of rules and discovering all of the possibilities, you know, with interlacing of a structure and, you know, moving the weft in other directions just besides in a horizontal direction, cutting up what you've woven and reconstructing it. So opening up those kinds of possibilities. And then with Karyl Sisson, you know, of course, there's this wonderful circle about Mary Jane having Jim come teach part-time at Cal State Long Beach. And then Karyl Sisson took over as professor of the fiber program. And then when I was ready to go back to graduate school, Karyl was in charge of the fiber program. And then I started to teach as a grad student. And then Jim Bassler was teaching weaving. So it's a wonderful connection and circle. But with Karyl Sisson, she really influenced me as far as thinking in emotional terms and how you relate to your material and how you can transform the material into an idea and something more conceptually oriented. And with her, I started to create more basket structures, but also to work with felt, and just a myriad other techniques that I still use in my work. So my work isn't just about one particular process, but I tend to dabble in many different kinds of materials, trying to express images of the body and relating to the figure.
Also mentioning that Jim was teaching overlapping time while Karyl was at UCLA, although did not study per se. Ferne, did you want to pick up and add to?
Okay, what's in my mind? I didn't expect to bring up my experience with John Cage and Ruth Cunningham and Robin Rauschenberg in that performance. And I'm wondering why I was so moved by it. And I was so moved by it. And I think it was that I saw you could really be crazy. You know, you could throw reason out the window, and yet they were very disciplined, but they were very free. And there was sort of chaos, but no chaos. I mean, there was no order. People were moving around the stage. There were electronics. There was a film going on. I loved all that participating with each other. Okay. Lenore I'm also thinking about my relationship with Lenore. Lenore, I have to say, is probably the deepest person I've ever known. And we could share our depths with each other. That's when I say that it was so meaningful, that we could sit there and have these discussions about life, about ourselves, about the world, about time. That's very rare to find that kind of relationship in one's life. And I don't know. I mean, our art, I loved everything she did. And I think she had a great deal of respect and love for what I did. So we just connected in these incredible ways with each other. There's two exhibits that haven't been mentioned that I think were very important. Magdalena, and maybe because I'm the oldest, I saw them. I don't know if you saw them or not. One was Magdalena Bakanowicz's exhibit at the Pasadena Art Museum before it became the Norton Simon Museum, that she had the whole space. Her work was incredible. That was an incredible exhibit, to see that exhibit. And it's true, in a way, it was a woman. She had the whole space, and she showed a confidence about herself, and the work was incredible. I love that exhibit. And at the same time, there was an exhibit at UCLA of international fiber. I think it was called Deliberate Entanglements, something like that. I'm not sure. But that was also quite a special thing for me to see, those two exhibits.
Did either of you see those as well? Yeah.
When I was at UCLA, I think my second year, Magdalena was a guest lecturer. No, a guest artist, teacher / and I did get to work with her for one semester. And we all, in the graduate department in fiber, got to go to, I think the show was at Claremont. We got to go to Claremont and watch how she set up her show, which I found very empowering, because I felt like, oh, you can say, no, I don't like that there, or this needs to be moved, or the lighting is off. And so yes, definitely her work made an impact on me as well, as what Ferne said. And also I want to say, the show that was maybe 4 or 5 years ago at the Hammer, the Black Mountain College show. Wow. I felt like these people were kindred spirits to me, and I didn't even realize it. because even Ruth Asawa's early work seemed similar to drawings that I had done. I could sort of see how she had developed, and it just felt wonderful to not feel so alone. To have other artists that you could admire and see as role models.
And clearly, you know, aside from the exhibition taking place recently, the impact, you know, was what happened in the moment in the 70s and 80s, certainly, when, you know, you were beginning to focus on fiber work. So that makes perfect sense. Ned, you mentioned Claremont. Was Ned Al-Hilali there at the time of that show?
Netta, I don't think so, but one of the reasons I was drawn to UCLA was originally seeing Netta's work, the very large plated work and the work she had that was photographed at the beach. But I did not study with her, and I don't think she was there then. I think that was later.
Perfect example of ways that the California landscape filters into fiber. Yes, Ferne?
I was just going to say, years later, I went to Claremont Graduate School to get an MFA, and Netta was the person who was running the fiber program at Claremont Graduate School. It's interesting, at Claremont Graduate School, we were part of the art department. The art department was a one piece, and you can choose your classes, and Netta taught the fiber. There was a textile area within the art department.
Well, the examples of Magdalena, you know, I think what you're saying in terms of the power of her pieces, and I know, Ferne, you talk about the feminine soul, exploring that in your work, and I wonder, you know, we did think a bit about feminism or the feminine in terms of your work, all of your work today. If we could talk a bit about how that plays out for each of you and where you feel your work fits on within that field, the feminine and the feminist. Feel free, any of you to begin.
Well, I'll say that my work is, I think, directly related to an emotional state, and coming from really the enjoyment of the figure, and thinking about approaching art that relates to the kind of size and height of a body is what I find really attractive in anyone's work, and particularly that's how I like to work. And so I was thinking about, with weaving, how you could transform the flat plane. So I taught myself how to make this double weave piece that would actually, you know, wind around and then formed it around a structure so it became dimensional.
And you speak about spine?
Yeah, spine. So I made that in graduate school, and as a flat plane, it reminded me of a snake skin. But I really was influenced by Karyl Sisson and her buttonhole canvas pieces, her sewn buttonhole pieces, and that idea of how information and feelings, emotions, senses, you know, seep into the body. And I was really influenced by Anne Hamilton's work and her ideas of we can know things by sensing. It doesn't have to be an intellectual capacity. And then I had the wax pieces, the orifices. I was influenced by a piece by Anne Coddington Rast, who had these wonderful small twine pieces positioned at the floorboard in one of her shows. And I thought about the orifice and how we have these openings in our body, and how things come in and out I was going through chemo treatments for breast cancer, and I really thought about the idea of the body before disease takes over. So just using plain wax to express that and to do something that was delicate and intimate and personal. And then the larger weaving was about aging, because I returned to school as an older student. And I was thinking about how our skin ages, and I wanted to express that in linen in a woven form, and studying with Jim Bassler and looking at how he did his wedge weaves and how those expanded. So you took a flat plane, but with wedge weave, it started to become something else. It started to ripple and become much more dimensional. So that piece was more about aging and memory.
You mentioned the personal and the intricate, and I think that's something that certainly comes through in both Karyl and Ferne's work. But how would each of you respond to ways that the feminine is a quality or consideration in your work? Karyl.
I have been drawn to objects that relate to the feminine, to domesticity and the feminine persona. So the work that I do already has a certain connection or identity in my mind with the feminine. The forms themselves, I guess I feel like the work almost always is a metaphor in one way or another, or a reflection of some emotional or psychological state in me. I can't always explain it at the time, but I feel that it's in there, and especially working with the idea of a vessel.
There's a lot of commonalities with Ferne's work and what you're describing in that case. Ferne, sorry, this is a cropped image of the piece in LAX. But yeah, in terms of the figurative and the vessel and that feminine core exploration, what are your thoughts? How are you exploring that in the work?
I think, I don't know, I'm just, it's so hard to go, I want to go back, but I don't know if I can. When this happened, where I said I could follow my own path, and I think that became a search to see what was feminine in life and in myself. And I've really just been in service to that my whole adult life. And it's really to learn what it is. I think women grew up, I did. I'll just speak for myself. I won't speak for everybody. For myself, I grew up, the feminine was something, there was something inferior about it, or there was something, emotions, you don't want emotions, blah, blah, blah. I think emotions are incredibly important. And listening to what Karyl said too, that I think the feminine that we don't like was the feminine defined by men, the sweetness, flashing, the flirtation. I think there's a feminine that is so beyond that. And that is what I've been in service to and trying to reach in my life. And I think what she is, what I've come to understand about it, is that she serves the deep values in life, that she knows what matters. She knows what we should value on a really deep level. It's not what we want, but it's what needs to get done. And so often we identify with what we want and the selfishness of the human race. and we do not do what needs to be done. And I think she really represents that. And maybe in my life to serve that, I don't know what I'm creating. I have a relationship with each piece that I make, and it's me and this other entity, whatever that is. And to me, it's my soul. It's this relationship between me and my soul. And it's that feminine quality in my soul.
Excellent. We do have a couple of questions coming from the audience, and feel free to add more, everybody. Maybe a contrast to this spiritual discussion is, but also I think related to questions of feminism, is the issue of financial aspects. This is from Libby Stevenson, and how being a working artist, has impacted you that way, making a living, and the fears of that, which may or may not be different in terms of being a female working artist. Whoever wants to take a stab at that.
I'll say one thing. Maybe a couple of things. Somebody said to me once, and I really believe this, it's really about devoting the devotion you have to your work. If you do the work can take care of you. If you don't do the work can never take care of you. Now, the work may take care of you and it may not. And being an artist is a struggle. I don't care if you're a woman or a man. I think it's a struggle either way. I think for women, at least for the kind of work I do, I think it's probably harder to be welcomed by the art world. But I've been shown, I've seen my work next to a de Kooning painting. I actually saw my work not in the same room, but I can look at my work at the same time, like they were next to each other, with a Van Gogh painting. And I watched the dialogue between them, and it was amazing. It was probably the most moving experience of my life, was to see my work next to a Van Gogh painting. That it's a struggle, and it might be more of a struggle if you're a woman. I don't even know. Each person has their own struggle, and I think what's important is how devoted you are to your work.
Carrie, we didn't even talk about your teaching as well, which I think is factoring aspect for a lot of artists who are also professional teachers.
Yeah, teaching has really occupied a great amount of my professional life. I've been in education and taught at many of the Southern California state schools. So that's basically how I've supported myself. And yet I still find it a struggle living in Los Angeles, having a large enough studio space after all these years. So,
Karyl, thoughts on the financial aspects of being an artist?
I think it's very difficult. As Ferne said, whether you're a man or a woman. I had a few really good years of selling my work. And if I needed the money, I would have to have a job. I would have to have a job. But I am in a fortunate position because I am married, and I have been married for 40 some odd years now. And it's just that my husband, we don't need my income to survive, thank goodness, because it would be meager. I don't know what else to say, except that I feel fortunate that I don't have that particular burden.
see. We're a bit over. I'm not seeing, let me just make sure there's no other questions, but final words, final thoughts on your work today and how you see it today as being indicative of being long-term LA, Southern California working artists. What do you draw from Southern California today?
I laugh. Oh my God. Huh?
Uh-oh.
I don't know. I don't know if there could be one specific thing because we're so all interconnected and interrelated globally. I mean, I obviously think of Hollywood, I think of the movie industry, and I think about telling my students, if you know how to make this, if you know how to work with materials, maybe you could go work in the film industry in costume or prop making and earn a career. Obviously, there are lots of graphic design jobs. So it'd be interesting to hear what Ferne and Karyl have to say about Southern California in particular.
It's funny, and I'll also say we exhibited your work, Carrie, several years ago in our Body Conscious exhibition. And, you know, when I think about your work, that's such a huge aspect tying back to feminism as well. In your work is body image and our culture here, which certainly, yes, is a global phenomenon that way, but is very significant in Southern California. So we always love seeing how that plays out in your work. But yes, Ferne, Karyl, how do you embody Southern California in your work in this day and age? Or do you feel like it doesn't at all?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ferne.
Now you go.
I think
we might be in the same place, actually.
I don't feel that my work is representative in a sense of Southern California, but I do feel nurtured by the environment and as I said before, the space. I know it's not Wyoming, but it feels like there's a big sky here. There are dangers, but I also want to say one thing that I didn't bring up. I think that in a way, we're involved with the intimate. The work is all handmade on a certain scale. We don't have a team. I mean, I'm not sure about you, Carrie, but I think we all do our own work. And it's okay to not make a piece that's 10 feet by 10 feet. That, at least for me, I'm trying to draw somebody in. And if they don't want to move in like that, okay, you know, I can't make them, but that's where I'm coming from. Ferne.
You've spoken about, I know for one, you've mentioned certainly over this past pandemic stretch, looking at LA landscape differently.
Of that. Oh, that's interesting. I mean, when you asked the question, I said, Carrie said we're so part of the world, which is true. But being home, I thought, I love being home. I haven't seen where Carrie lives, but Karyl lives in a beautiful environment. And I live in a Karyl and I both live in kind of a quasi-natural environment. And I love being here. I even at some point looked to move to New York I was looking into New Mexico. And I saw nothing that I loved as much as where I live. And I've lived
The
here
desert.
for 50 years, huh?
You would
What?
have your desert. If you moved
If
to
I
New
lived, yeah,
Mexico,
if I lived in New Mexico, I'd have the desert.
Yeah.
But nothing moved me as much as being where I am. And so thank you, Southern California.
Yeah.
Thank you, LA. I was going to say one other thing. Oh, during the pandemic. Well, that's the point too. I spent so much time alone. You know what? I got used. There's a couple of things. I got used to looking out and starting to count all the different types of trees I could look at, and I'm amazed at what the earth produces. It's so phenomenal to me. And I never saw it so clearly as I did during this pandemic. And how we don't know how to honor it is mind-boggling to me, that we don't just be so thankful for what we have and where we live and what we're part of. So the other thing is I had to drive my car in order to keep the battery going. Otherwise, there was no reason for me to do anything. And I wanted to drive away from the city. So about 3 times a week, I just got in my car and I headed toward, Mount Wilson up the 2. But I never went that far. I found these 2 places where I could just sit on these hills and look at the sky. I did feel like I was in New Mexico. I thought, I've got it here. I don't have to go to, I wanted to go to New Mexico to look at the sky. But I could see it here. And I would just sit in these places. And I would look out at the sky. And what I realized was there are these processes that go on whether we're here or not. And they're so beyond us. To watch those clouds move through the sky, to watch the colors that the sky creates, to watch the sun go down. I would do it always around sunset. I was doing this for over a year and a half. I would go about 3 times a week. I'd sit there for maybe 10, 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes. And I would just watch the sky change. And what is doing that? What creates this movement, and what is behind these forces that we know nothing about that are there and keep things going? And we need to honor that. We really need to honor them.
These are everything that you each said just now is exactly why it seemed ideal and absolutely perfect to include these pieces in the LAX exhibition in terms of the first glimpses that people get when they arrive to the city of some of the best and finest. So, and you each are. So thank you so much for sharing this little glimpse into your work today and your history, and tracing a little bit of Southern California's fiber history today.